What does Russia's hybrid war in Ukraine looks like?
So Russia is our research has shown that there is a network of accounts that are acting in a coordinated manner on Twitter to spread pro-Russian disinformation and propaganda related to Ukraine. The narratives that these accounts are spreading seem to be very closely correlated with talking points from the Kremlin, and indeed from President Putin himself, as evidenced by his speech given a couple days ago. So we have good reason to suspect that these accounts are in some way either influenced by or in support of Russian interests.
Coordinated. Because you have mentioned Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin wrote in July, I believe last year, an article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where he claimed there that an independent Ukraine is an anti-Russia project. We have all listened to Vladimir Putin's speech Monday evening. It was a striking example of what we usually call, rewriting of history, the rewriting of history. Is there anything new in Putin's last speech from this point of view of a false narrative?
Yeah, I think what's new is not so much the substance. As you correctly pointed out, he's been saying these things for years, but what's new is the audience that he is choosing to say these things to. Because previously, mostly Vladimir Putin and his supporters would echo these talking points about how Russia was robbed in the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine is not a real country, but to a domestic audience. What was interesting on Monday to me was seeing him deliberately use a televised address that he knew would be closely watched all over the world to make this case. It was almost like a declaration of a new ideology that he wanted to make to the rest of the world, not so much to the Russians who were used to hearing him say this. I think that who he was saying it to is much more significant and new than what he was actually saying.
What are the main narratives on Ukraine that Russia has promoted lately?
Yeah, so there are a number of them. The most, what we are seeing, first of all, the number of suspicious accounts or accounts that are promoting disinformation and pro-Russian propaganda has dramatically increased in the last 3 months. Between November and December alone, there was a 3,000% increase in the volume of tweets that these accounts were making. But the number of accounts also has been growing, at least doubling, tripling, sometimes tenfold every month since then. So that's important to note, that the number of accounts, the volume of tweets related to Ukraine has been increasing. And by the way, some of these accounts previously were tweeting pro-Russian propaganda about other topics around the world. They were tweeting about Libya, or they were tweeting about the United States. And they have switched to talking about Ukraine, which tells us some power that controls them has reallocated resources because this is the priority now.
It was a plan behind.
Exactly, it was coordinated and planned. The main narratives are one that this is Ukrainian aggression, not Russian aggression. So you saw that in Putin's speech as well. Also that NATO and the US cannot be trusted. We are seeing a lot of this on social media. And interestingly, they are tweeting in other languages, in European languages, in French, Italian, German, Spanish, and the tweets are saying you cannot trust the US. So one of the narratives is the attempt is to try and break up the unity of the US-European alliance. Another narrative that we're seeing is that this is all politicized. They're trying to politicize it for the US audience. They're saying if you are left-wing, then you support Biden and you support Ukraine. If you are right-wing, for example, we saw tweets by pro-Russian accounts saying if Trump was president, this would never be happening. So they're trying to get the US to fight each other. And another major narrative that we're seeing consistently from January till now is that Russia is merely responding to provocations from the West, that this is not something that Russia wants to do, but is compelled to do. And the narratives are also changing, Magda. What we saw in November, December was much more geared towards a English-speaking audience. Then in January, we started seeing them talk more in French, Italian, Spanish to try and get these European countries to not be loyal. One of the narratives we saw in January very, very commonly was that Germany is not on the same page as the rest of Europe, that actually Germany does not want war, but the US is pressuring it. So trying to exploit these fissures. When Germany refused to sell weapons to the Ukraine, they were celebrating that. But then what we are starting to see now, and what I expect you will see going forward, is a lot more tweets in the Russian language and a lot more narratives about how Ukraine is committing war crimes and extreme violence in the eastern part, because now the audience is going to shift back to a domestic audience. As Putin realizes that the window for negotiating with the West is pretty much closing, and the sanctions start to hurt people back in Russia, they are going to want to understand, why are we fighting this war? He needs to justify it very strongly, and in order to do that, what we're starting to see now is a lot of viral disinformation tweets showing Ukrainian shelling or Ukrainian attacks on civilians and elderly people, to try and show that this is a war we have to be a part of, because they've realized now that they were not able to convince Europe to split up on this issue. So now they're going to go back to focusing on the domestic audience.
You know, here in Romania, the main narrative is the Ukraine politics towards minorities. Is a narrative also used by Viktor Orban at Budapest, and also by Putin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please.
No, go ahead.
Does Moscow, Kremlin use different narratives in the West and Eastern Europe? Because we have different histories with Russia.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. I think they do, to some extent, use different narratives. For example, with the West and with the United States, the narrative is one narrative we saw very common, and actually this was common in December, January, and February, so it seems to be a popular narrative, is that the US should focus on its own border with Mexico, not worry about Ukraine and Russia. So the narrative with the West is they're trying to frame this as an immigration issue. We are protecting our borders. And they're amplifying conservative news personalities like Tucker Carlson and Glenn Greenwald, who are making the case that the US should not get involved in this conflict. Whereas I think you're right, in Eastern Europe or in other parts of the world that have a closer history with Russian influence and occupation, they realize that the same narrative simply won't work. But I do think that their focus, at least mostly so far, has been on trying to, what we saw, for example, in November and December and in the early parts of January, most of the tweets were shifting. They had started with mostly Russian and Ukrainian tweets, but they were shifting to more English tweets because they were clearly trying to influence NATO members and English-speaking world. Now that they're seeing that's not working so much, they're shifting back to French, Italian. Once they see that, okay, everybody's putting sanctions, it's going to go back to Russian. So I think the narratives are different, and also which group they're focusing on at which moment of time has been changing. So I think you'll see more focus on Eastern European countries now than you did before, when it was all about trying to prevent the West from having a unified response to Russian aggression.
What about narratives used in Ukraine for Ukrainians?
Yeah, there's actually, over there, it's also split. They're not trying to convince Ukrainians in Kiev or Lviv because they know that that's not going to happen. The narratives are focused on the separatist movements in Donetsk and Luhansk. So those narratives are simply that, you are Russian. That is the simplest narrative we are seeing, that you already, you have an ethnic and a historical relationship with Russia. We are here to protect you from a puppet government of the West. They know that this narrative is very emotionally strong in that part of the country because they have close ties linguistically, culturally to Russia. So basically the narrative in those parts of the country is all about, in Ukraine, sorry, is all about focusing on the East and talking about how Russia is culturally much more similar to them than the West, and that Kiev is nothing more than a puppet of the West.
We saw also in Putin's speech the so-called denigration of Ukraine, corruption, failed state, failed society.
No, I don't think it's resonating much in Ukraine. I think the speech, was a little bit more justifying to that part of the speech, I think he was speaking more to a domestic audience, and explaining to them why this war is necessary, but also to third-party countries that may be looking for a reason to not get involved. I'm talking about India, China, countries that now, you know, hearing talking points like this, you know, it was Putin's way, I think, of saying that there is a case to be made for the Russian point of view on all of this, and you don't have to simply follow the West's lead on this. And I think it's interesting because we're seeing, Magda, on social media, some of the pro-Russian accounts are tweeting very specifically about countries that have nothing to do with the conflict, like India, and saying you should not get involved. But if you do, you should be supporting Russia because X, Y, Z. And they're targeting Turkey and India, which is very interesting to me because it shows an awareness that in order to have a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they will need some international support. And I think it's a very dangerous sign, unfortunately, because it shows that their designs are far greater than just reclaiming some land in the east.
How do you fight effectively against the fake news? Because, you know, how useful is to say a posteriori that a story that everyone has heard already is actually a lie?
So it's a great question. One strategy that I think the United States has been using, which has been quite successful and quite different than what they did in the past, is to openly talk about the Russian tactics before, as soon as they see them. So in the past, with Crimea, for example, a lot of the same propaganda was being spewed, but the intelligence community was keeping all that classified. To me, this is a very effective way of fighting, because if you say, my enemy is going to do this, this is what they are thinking, they're going to do this, you put them in a very uncomfortable position. If they do it, it looks like you know them very well and you predicted it, and it makes you look smart, which Russia doesn't want the Americans to look smart. And if you don't do it, it makes it look like you got scared of their warnings and so you didn't do it. So it's a very smart, I think, strategy by the US. It's not going to work in preventing Russia from doing what it wants, but it will help galvanize public opinion and raise the education level of people around the world on this conflict, which is very important. Because I was thinking, you know, if America had not been publicly making the intelligence, you know, public and available to everyone and saying they're going to do a false flag, you know, for weeks we've been hearing about this. If America had not done that and Europe had not done that, most of the world would have woken up on Monday and it would have been the first time they heard about the Ukraine crisis, because they would have seen this speech and they would have thought, oh, okay, I don't know what's happening. Maybe Russia is right. Maybe Ukraine is right. I don't know. But now, because they've been hearing all the strategies, everything has been out in the open. People know that Russia is an aggressor here. And so its arguments of peacekeepers and all that are not going to resonate with the international community. You even see countries like China, which obviously just signed a number of friendly agreements with Russia. Even China has not outrightly said they support what Russia is doing. They've remained neutral at best. And you see countries around the world taking either a neutral or a pro-Western stance. Very few, with the exception of Belarus and a few others who are close to the Russian circle of influence. Whereas I think if America and the West had not adopted this strategy of being very transparent and being very immediate about releasing intelligence, then people would not be as informed, and public opinion would be less, would be more towards Russia, or at least less critical and scrutinizing of Russian aggression.
So would you say that United States learned how to use this hybrid war, an information offensive?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson they learned is that transparency is key here. That we live in a world now where keeping classified secrets is becoming harder and harder to do. And also that one of the things that the Russian state and the Kremlin and Putin has always been very sensitive to is international opinion and reputation. And by talking about the bad actions that Russia is taking in the information cyberspace, they're really hurting the Russians where they know it will make an impact, and they are building support for what they know is coming. And it also, by the way, makes the Americans look intelligent, because it looks like they were correct. Biden said weeks ago, I think Putin has decided to invade. At the time, a lot of people said, oh, how can he say that? In fact, the Russian trolls and the Russian accounts that we were monitoring were making fun of Biden and saying, look, there's no invasion. And so now the world is seeing that, okay, it's becoming clearer to see which side is being honest and transparent and which one is not. And I think that's not good for the Russians. So that's a big lesson that the Americans have learned, not just from Crimea, but I think even from the US elections and from other instances of misinformation.